Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we are joined by author Alex Hortis as he delves into his new book, The Witch of New York. Hortis explores the sensational 1840s murder trial of Polly Bodine, America's first media circus trial. He'll discuss the ruthless journalists, attorneys, and public intrigue that made Bodine's case a milestone in the history of American tabloid justice. Drawing from his research at the New York State Archives, Hortis will offer insights into the case's relevance to our modern media landscape. Alex Hortis is a constitutional lawyer and historian of crime. He has appeared on national television as an on-screen personality for AMC's The Making of the Mob. Hortis has been interviewed on NPR stations across the country and for true crime podcasts. He has also been a featured speaker at the New York Public Library, the Enoch Pratt Free Library, and the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. His first book, The Mob and the City, The Hidden History of How the Mafia Captured New York, focused on uncovering the history of how the mafia dominated organized crime in New York City from the 1930s through the 1950s. For his new book, The Witch of New York, he has done extensive research at the New York State Archives. Tom Ruller retired from his position as New York State Archivist in 2022. An active professional for 35 years, Tom is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. For those of you who have joined us today, welcome for this, our sort of Halloween edition. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll set aside a few minutes at the end to get to as many of those as we can. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Alex Hortis and Tom Ruller.
Thank you, Josie. And hello, Alex. It's great to talk to you again. And I think this particular program combines a bunch of things that I love. First, it uses court records, which are really important, rich resources. So it combines records that are coming out and preserved in the archives with I'll say the secondary resources, but to some extent they're sort of primary, is newspapers to tell really the full story and to sort of help discern the truth about something. It also talks about Staten Island, which I think is a wonderful place to visit. And it's not a whole lot about Staten Island, but it's going to be a great program. And it's a wonderful book. And we'll talk a little bit more about the book towards the whole story here today is about the book. But I encourage anyone who's watching this to buy the book. It's totally worth it. You're going to love the story. Alex is a great storyteller, and it's totally worthwhile. So thank you. Thank you for sharing this with us today.
Thank you, Tom. I'm thrilled. I've had two fantastic experiences at the New York State Archives. So as soon as I got the invitation, I just leapt at it. You ran a first-rate organization, and I have nothing but good experiences and found invaluable sources.
That's fantastic. Good. Yeah, we pride ourselves on being able to provide a good, supportive environment for researchers such as yourself. So let's talk about The Witch of New York. You've got a wonderful PowerPoint, so maybe I'll cue that up and we can talk through the story of Polly Bodine and what really happened and on both sides of that story. So let me get this PowerPoint started. And whoops. All right. Hopefully everyone can see this. But let me go. Whoops, it's moving pretty quick. So I'll try to pause it here. Whoop. All right. The Curious Case of Polly Bodine.
So, like Tom had said, there is multiple parts to this. Part of it is a murder mystery. Part of it is a commentary on tabloid justice. Part of it is sort of just a history of New York and New York City and the law. And so just as background, so on Christmas night, 1843, Yeah, what I would do, Tom, is that do instead of the slideshow version of it, you just do a click-through version of it.
I'll do that. Yep.
Yeah. But as background, so Granite Village, Staten Island, now known as Graniteville, it's kind of in northeast Staten Island. In 1840s, was home principally to descendants of the Dutch, the English, some Germans, former African slaves, and was only 10,000 people at the time. But now it's 600,000. It's a completely different world. Oystermen, Manhattan is, I'm sure you all know, it was going through an oyster craze, and so Staten Island's primary industry was feeding the East Coast with oysters. They had like really great waters for oysters. And farmers. And so on Christmas night, 1843, a village of about 300 people, their Christmas night, there was a couple of men that were drinking at the only tavern in town, and they heard screams of fire, fire, fire. And so they just ran out of the bar, and they ran over. There was a boy in the street who was pointing towards Captain George Houseman. Captain George Houseman was an oysterman. He was away at sea, and the kitchen was on fire. It was a very intense fire. And it was like, they're very disciplined with fire. So they had a set of water line, they put it out. But when the men were searching through it, they were told that his wife and young daughter, Emmeline and Ann Eliza, were away with the relatives, and they were cleaning it through, though they thought they hit like a sheep or a dog. Sadly, it instead was the corpses of the two bodies. They were very badly burnt. It was a nauseous scene. I won't go into too much detail, but the first person that saw it literally had to go outside to throw up. They appeared there were defensive left wounds on her left arm on Emmeline, who was about 24 years old. Ann Eliza was about 18 months old, and it appeared to be a murder scene. And suspicions then, as you can imagine, next slide, as you can imagine, it's a horrific idea. You go from the serenity of Christmas to this ghastly murder scene. This is the scene of the house, Captain George Houseman's home. Next door to him lived his sister and their parents, Polly. And fairly soon, suspicion fell on Polly. So next slide. Now, this is actually the real antagonist of the book, more so than even Polly or the prosecutors or the defense attorneys. James Gordon Bennett, and I had never really encountered him before this book, but when I read about him, I think he may be one of the top 5 worst persons I've ever encountered who didn't actually kill somebody. He was, vicious bigot even for his era. He was sort of the original troll. He would, compare himself to Shakespeare, and he was going to, the Shakespeare of the printing press. But he was a very talented writer, and so people loved his work. And the Sun didn't hire him, and so he started his own paper, kind of out of bitterness, the New York Herald. And what they did was, the penny press was, we had newspapers before the 1830s, but they were either party organs, or they were financial journals that were kind of boring. And so the Sun founder, and then James Gordon Bennett, had this idea of writing a paper kind of for the masses. New York was actually quite literate at the time, and working class people, were reading stuff on the docks and, in their various workshops. And they had this kind of breakthrough idea, is go to the overnight criminal court, watch these little mini dramas of, it can be assault and batteries, it can be, theft, robbery, and write them up as human drama stories. And the people loved it. They loved it. It originally started with the working class, but pretty soon, like Mayor Philip Hone noticed how they were, that the upper classes were kind of sneaking at copies too and reading them too. People loved it. And so James Gordon Bennett, he was looked down upon by kind of the bar, which didn't like his reporting on criminal trials. And so he came up with this maxim that he really did try to live by, unfortunately. It said the press is the living jury of the nation. And when you think about this, the implications of this are frightening. The idea that the press is going to decide your case which should be horrifying to anybody. But he would do this. He would take sides in cases. He famously took sides in the Helen Jewett, Richard Robinson murder case. And he would just openly advocate for one side or the other. They and the Sun, his kind of arch rival, Moses Yale, Beach, they would just rush to print anything they could. They had carrier pigeons on the roof to go get, the news. And they learned very quickly that you got to have the news fast, and that was important. But he lived by this. So next slide. He almost immediately indicted Polly. First, he said it was a gang. Then within a couple of days, he switched his mind to Polly. This is before she's indicted, okay? And then he goes to Staten Island. He's sort of a man on the scene kind of thing, the man on the scene reporter. He liked to do this, and he liked to visit the scene of the crime and write about it in almost, dramatic, sometimes erotic even detail, and as a female victim. And then he wrote they would hang her without judge or jury on Staten Island, kind of ignoring the fact that he had sort of helped to stir up this very strong early sentiment. This is the first woodcut illustration of Polly. Now, keep in mind, she's a 34-year-old woman. But when you see this, though, she looks 60s or 70s, older, deeply etch-faced. Her attorney had her wear black, but they really, she's almost dissolving in the ink, and she's kind of clasping her hands. She doesn't really have a desirable face. And when combined with this and some other things we'll see, I kind of posit that she fits comfortably into like the witch archetype. And what do I mean by that? Well, we of course had witch trials, and they were all up and down the coast. It wasn't just Salem. But what happened is, even when the witch trials ended, we still have this image of the notorious woman. Generally older, single-ish, hostile to children, wears black. She, vaguely sexual or sometimes overtly sexual, but in a sinister kind of way. And Polly kind of fit into this. So the penny press immediately jumped. She's a perfect archetype. And so next slide. So this is the National Police Gazette, kind of the first national tabloid. And this is while her trials are going on. They're like not holding back at all. They just paint the scene, the murder of Mrs. Houseman and child by Polly, and she's like walking off, looks really evil. And as the fire burns their bodies. And this is during, while she's on trial for capital murder. So there's no pretense, at least in the press, any kind of presumption of innocence or anything like that. Who was Polly? Just a little bit of background on her. She actually had a difficult life. She married very young, as a young teen, and to basically a sailor who at the time had prospects, but turned in to be kind of a drunk and an abusive man. They said vicious and intemperate, which was kind of, that era's code for he beat her and was a drunk. And, drove their family into poverty until she finally moved out with her two young children and moved back to her father's home on Staten Island. Now, this was extremely scandalous. And she couldn't get a divorce, really. The only real ground for divorce in her situation was adultery, and adultery is very hard to prove, and it's embarrassing. And so very few people actually got divorced. I think, this is before the liberalization, even by 1800 standards, of the divorce laws. And so she couldn't get a divorce. So she remained married to Andrew, her drunken husband. Her drunken husband actually eventually decides to go marry somebody else while he's still married to him. And she ends up dead in their bed. He's originally looked at for murder, but then they couldn't convict him on that. So they did convict him on bigamy and sent him up to Sing Sing. But Polly is blamed for all of this. Immediately, there were false stories that Polly had killed his second wife, that that Polly was responsible for the, the dissolution of their marriage. Polly was essentially a harlot. Is essentially it was kind of a version of slut shaming, essentially. Next slide. This is a notorious pamphlet. This was distributed in Newburgh in the third trial. We'll get into why there were three, but in Newburgh, the third trial, and it's called The Early Life of Polly Bodine. And these kind of like cheap pamphlets were very popular at the time. And they were like little crime pamphlets. I kind of compare them to kind of our true crime documentaries of today. So like there's supposedly a version of this person. In this case, they really demonized her. They had this whole backstory that was not true, that she had all these affairs, that she was, had affairs with this Frenchman and was leaving children behind, went up and down the East Coast having affairs. But it was distributed while she was on trial for capital murder. And notice it's anonymous. So even back then they had to worry. The people sued for defamation all the time back then. And so the author was such excrement and knowing it was false, like put it as, anonymous. So next slide. This is one of the most lurid things I've ever seen anywhere. So what this supposedly was is supposedly, according to the author, the fictionalized account, they found these hairs in the apothecary of her paramour. So she started a relationship, an illicit affair, with George Waite, who was an apothecary in Canal Street in Manhattan. He did undoubtedly have abortifacients. Abortion was very common at this point in time in the 1840s. And abortifacients were sold by apothecary. But this took it a whole nother step further. So the claim is, as you can see, these are, dates, and then they have girl or boy, and then these supposed representations of hairs. And what this is represented to be is she gave birth to 7 children. It's not clear as the birth or infanticide. They kind of blur that. But then she smothers them and, or aborts them. It's not clear, and then kept the hairs bizarrely, because again, this witch archetype, when you think about it, what do witches do? Witches kill children, right? And so this is what they're representing here. And so it completely fictionalized. This actually turned people off. It was so repulsive. They bought a lot of copies of it, and they're around New York a lot. There's actually a fair number in various places here. So next slide. Back cover, you may have recognized this scene before. This is taken almost identically from the National Police Gazette. So I don't know whether somebody just blatantly copied it, or alternative theory is that somebody at the National Police Gazette decided to have a side business. They did know a lot about the case. So one theory is that they kind of ran this on the side, but they didn't want to have it too attached to the National Police Gazette, so they just ran this as a little side hustle. So next slide. P.T. Barnum. So who loves P.T. Barnum? Everybody. Lovable rogue, right? Lovable rogue. I will tell you, like when I talk to people who read up on who read biographies of Barnum, and then and talk to sort of everyone else, there's a big difference of opinion, and I will join in that, because he's, if you saw, that Hugh Jackman movie, like A Greatest Showman, he's just trying to entertain people, and he puts on a good show. But when you actually, read about him, he was ruthless. Like he would write in letters, things like, I need more monsters. I need more monsters. They kept saying that. And he would get, so he capitalized on this trial. So while Polly is on trial at City Hall in New York, at his American Museum, he has this hideous wax figure of her. And he runs this and claims it's a faithful representation of Polly Bodine. It was not a faithful. What people said was it was a hideous, old, witch-like figure who was like, and like the children had nightmares about it for years, they would say. And, in this, some kind of panoramic scene or whatever, of death and murder. And so it's like a horrible representation of her. and it's right by the courthouse. And so like, this is the real P.T. Barnum. He was actually against the death penalty when he was in the legislature, but above all, he called himself the Prince of Humbug. Sell tickets, sell a show. People love to get tricked. That was his theory. People like to get tricked so long as they're entertained. Okay, so next one. Edgar Allan Poe was interested. This case was so big. So Poe was a huge follower of the penny press, and particularly, as you can imagine, the crime coverage. He also had, the ego the size of Texas. And so one thing that he did here, he commented, he said, the trial of Polly Bodine will take place at Richmond on Monday next and will no doubt excite much interest. This woman may possibly escape, for they manage these matters wretchedly in New York. And, that actually tells you quite a bit about Poe, actually. First of all, she knows she's guilty. He solved the crime before there's any testimony. And then, he has a really disdainful attitude towards the new police, the new authorities. He thinks that he can solve crimes by simply reading newspapers. So he had the famous or infamous, Mary Rogers murder case, this beautiful cigar girl. And he writes, Marie Roget, this very thinly veiled, where he, quote, tries to solve the crime, but unfortunately he gets the suspect wrong in the course of the serial. And so he gives himself kind of a literary out. And he says in the last issue, well, he adds details they didn't have before to point towards essentially a botched abortion, which seemed to be the case, possibly. And he says, but I can't reveal it, for legal purposes. And so he kind of gets out of it. But anyway, so he takes interest in this case, and he thinks she's guilty, and he thinks the police will bungle it. So next. Now, these are all supposedly images of Polly, and you can see her image changes depending on how vilified or relatively has relative sympathy over the course of her case. So in the lower left, this is kind of the, virginal version of young Polly. And then this, kind of sinister. Now her lawyers did dress her in this black mourning veil. And the idea was her lawyers were very savvy. She had a wealthy family. And so her family could bankroll essentially a dream team. And there was this attorney named David Graham who did all the major cases. He later defended Madame Rostel, the abortionist, and all kinds of infamous cases. But he portrays her as a fallen woman. So that's how he spins Polly's predicament. She's actually a fallen woman. And then we have, this is the Newburgh one, the third one, just probably the most realistic one based on the physical descriptions. And then this later one, this is where, phrenology, they claim that Polly had sort of like a, couldn't love nobody because of her sharp nose and head and all this angular face. But you can see the images, and actually, if you'll notice this, when there's a high profile cases now, the image of the woman in particular matters a lot, and how they change it. In fact, they even just kind of change descriptions sometimes, and they're, depending on where they are in the case. So next slide. So this is a murder mystery. So for people who are interested in that, I do want to briefly, run through it, and it's sort of running through it. But the case was circumstantial, but fairly strong. There are some major problems with it. But what happened was, so on Saturday, December 23rd, remember, again, Polly is living next door to George Houseman and her sister-in-law, Emmeline, and Annalisa. Polly, on that Saturday, December 23rd, she sends a note to her relatives telling them to keep her daughter away from Emmeline's home. They would take turns when Captain Houseman was away at sea, sleeping with her because she was kind of a timid woman and was afraid. And then at 5 p.m. on that day, Polly goes over to stay with Emmeline and Annalisa. And Polly is the last person seen alive. Now, the fact that she went over there was not particularly unusual, although the daughter tended to, but she was the last person seen alive. At that night, a neighbor, Dane Taylor, says she hears screams coming from the direction of Captain Houseman's home. Now, the problem is she doesn't tell anyone. There's no one else in the village who reports hearing the screams. So she's unsure. And in a kind of comical scene in the courtroom, the defense picks up on the fact that she actually believes in ghosts. And so they ask her, now, isn't it true that you've seen ghosts before? And she said, well, no, I'm not sure. I haven't seen one in at least 2 or 3 months. And the courtroom laughs, breaks into laughter. So it's a bad witness when they start laughing at you. So I think the prosecution made a little bit of a mistake by focusing too much on this timeline. Now, the next day, Christmas Eve day, Emily and Annalisa would always stay in the front living room and they'd watch people go by. Annalisa was too unruly to bring to church. And so like they would wave and wave every Sunday to many of them relatives, friends. It was dark that day for the first time that anybody could remember. Completely dark, quiet. They were not there. Now, Catherine von Naum, this is one of Polly's sisters. She comes from a very large, old school Dutch family. This predates the founding, right? Like among the first settlers, in the New World among the Dutch. She testifies, she claims that she saw Emmeline getting wood logs that Sunday. So this upends the prosecution's timeline. Prosecution argues, this is your sister, you're trying to save her. And so that's sort of their take on her. And then Matilda Rourke, who is actually the niece of both Polly and Emmeline, she testifies that she's 250 yards away and she didn't see the face, but she said that based on the swinging of the arms, that was how Emmeline swung her arms. And so she says that was Emmeline. So not the strongest witness either, but somebody who corroborates sort of, Carolyn Van Naum. Polly stays overnight at George House at their father's home. So the defense is closing the window of when she could have committed the murders. So she doesn't, so they say she never left the house. So the murders couldn't have taken place on Christmas Eve. But then on December 25th, a neighbor comes by and knocks on the door to get medicine. And Polly tells the boy to go away, to stop it and go away. Now, the prosecution wants that to be implied that that's evidence that there were dead bodies in there. And they didn't want the boy to keep finding a way in or something. Then Polly goes to Manhattan on Christmas Day. She buys a green veil and boots with her son, Albert. Her son, Albert, became an apprentice to George Waite, her paramour, the apothecarist in Manhattan. So she goes and visits them fairly regularly. Albert says the son says he had no idea they're having an affair. As we will, as people later find out, she is 8 months pregnant. Okay, she's 8 months pregnant with George Waite's child. And one of the issues that comes up George Waite is in debt. He's like a typical kind of sporting man of Manhattan. He's kind of deeply in debt. And so he borrows money from Polly's father, takes out promissory notes. Kind of sounds like, we've seen this type before, right? I mean, like borrowing money from the girlfriend's father. I mean, my goodness. And so, and then, so then he has a potential motive as we will see. But in any event, on that afternoon, and this is sort of the most crucial evidence. So Polly has no alibi for Christmas afternoon. She's gone from the apothecary. And depending on the trial, between 3 or 4 pawnbrokers testify, and they say that someone named Ellen Henderson, calling herself Ellen Henderson of Bergen, pawned Emmeline's valuables. And there's no question that these are Emmeline's valuables. And so it's potentially damning evidence because this is 9 hours before the body are discovered. Then at 4 p.m., this is Christmas Day, she suddenly leaves and her son goes, well, where are you going? This is Christmas. He said, I'm going to go see Elizabeth Strange, my friend. They bring Elizabeth Strange to the stand. She says, I hadn't seen Polly in 6 months. And so Polly lied to her son about where she was headed on Christmas. Then William Richardson, now this is another defense witness, said that he saw a man in a Spanish cloak outside the house of Emmeline Hausman's. residence. So so the defense builds this whole gang theory. At the time, gangs were a big problem. They were Irish gangs, Irish or native born gangs. And so they build on this. And then at 6:20, the day after Christmas, a boat worker named Catherine Henry testifies that Polly came to the boat 2 hours before it was supposed to leave near the quarantine on the other side of the island, and orders gin and drinks gin at 6:20 in the morning. And they asked her, it was so vivid. And she said, I thought it was just delightful that a woman would order gin by herself, let alone at 6:20 in the morning. And so it's a very compelling witness. The reporters all said she happened to be African American, and those they would say colored witness. All the reporters agreed she was a very compelling witness. Polly then is absent when people come to the apothecary to tell Albert and Polly about this fire. And of course, the night before on Christmas Day, when Polly has no alibi. And then Polly returns to Staten Island. However, she then shops first with Albert, kind of weird, but she shops first. And then back on Staten Island, she sends this alibi note. So next. So this is her note, and I won't read it all the way through, but the key kind of sentences in the middle here. And basically it says, you and Albert must say that Albert came to the Jersey Ferry for me, and I remained with you all day, with the exception of 15 minutes when I went to Spring City to get a basket mended. I was going to spend some days, but the brother came to let me know. That was obviously not true. She was gone all afternoon and all evening, Christmas night. So this is a false alibi. And so the prosecution uses this as consciousness of guilt, because Albert testifies. They compel Albert to testify. He said, my mom was, my mom, he doesn't want to be, but he says, my mom left. She was gone much of her Christmas. So next. So people they really are concerned about this. I've noticed as a after talking to groups, and it's a legitimate point. The defense made the most of it. Where's the motive here? So everyone testified that Polly had very warm relations. Polly actually delivered Annalisa when the doctor was on the other side of the island. And Polly's family at least testified that she was supported financially. And more importantly, she knew that her brother kept his money at her father's home. So there really wouldn't have been any need. The pawned items had some value, but they were under $1,000 in current value. So it wasn't, is this enough to kill your sister-in-law and your infant niece? That's the big questions. But then, I have then also talked to defense attorneys and prosecutors, and they have brought this up as well. But homicides, are they really logical? And I'll just leave that out for you. Think of how people do awful things to family members for bad reasons. So next. What about Waite? So George Waite, her, sporting man, kind of bum boyfriend. So he impregnates her. He's broke. He borrows money from her father. The humiliation that's about to come here, because remember, Nathaniel Hawthorne writes the Scarlet Letter here, but it's actually he's writing as around this time. It's actually a commentary on the current society too. Adultery was so severely punished, especially a woman. Not for a man so much, some embarrassment, but a woman, especially to bear the child of somebody who's not your husband, she would have been experienced a social death. She would have been just a harlot, just the worst possible woman, imaginable. Did George, he's deeply in debt. Was this some kind of cockamamie scheme? That's what the defense implied. And they said Polly didn't know anything about it, and that George did it. The problem is George has an alibi. The son says that he was with him over Christmas weekend. He was charged as a murder, as an accessory after the fact, because he acted really suspiciously that day, that Christmas day. And he is telling, he's telling them, Albert, go away. I don't want you to ask your mother questions. So next. So the gang theory. So this is the gang theory. Defense lawyers often make use of what's in the zeitgeist. And what's in the zeitgeist is people are very worried about all these gangs that are roaming through New York City at the time. And so who is this man in the Spanish cloak? This William Richardson is interesting because he really has no known motive to lie. He was just riding by, but he swears he saw a man in a Spanish cloak walking outside of her house with an unidentified woman. Doesn't say doesn't identify as Polly, but he says that it was some kind of woman. And so the defense hold this up, and they kind of put New York City on trial. They said all these awful gangs are coming invading Staten Island, and like they really did it. So like, this is what defense attorneys do. Like they have to come up with alternative theories. Next. This was shocking to me. So during the trials, the defense attorney, this is David Graham Jr., he was among the various, high society in Manhattan, the best lawyer in New York at that time. And he knew that the pawnbrokers were a problem for him. The pawnbrokers happened to be Jewish. And so he decided to launch a really blatantly anti-Semitic attack. He would talk derisively about the pawnbroking Jews and a Christian woman, and say that they're all liars essentially. And it was shocking for me. I knew that there was anti-Semitism, but the idea of it being in a court proceeding was shocking to me. Next. Fortunately, this was heroic, I thought, actually. Judge Edmonds, the trial, the judge in Manhattan, said, "I know of nothing in the character, habits, or religion of Jews calculated to call upon us to disbelieve their testimony any more than that of Christians, or justify for a moment the act of passing a wholesale condemnation on any class in this case." And so, like, I thought this was heroic. I mean, at that time, it wouldn't have been inconceivable that it would have passed without comment, but he did say something. And so give him some credit. So next. Now, let's get to the New York State Archives. I would not have been able to complete this book without the New York State Archives. And that is, it's amazing. Like I've said, I only had wonderful experiences at the State Archives. And strongest among them are your legal briefs that you keep. I mean, think about this. This is 180 years ago. I'm pretty sure, other than the archivist, I was the first person to pull these briefs in those 180 years. And it was invaluable because it gave me, it doesn't look like much, when you see it in a pile, but when you start reading it, it tells little stories and little vignettes, because what they were trying to do is they're trying to move the case out of Staten Island because there was so much prejudice. So next. And this is a perfect example where archives get turned into the storytelling aspect of a book, because they did these details that weren't even necessarily covered by the press, because the press was kind of defensive that they were ginning up everybody. So they told the story, and they said, on this, it was great excitement and strong prejudice against Polly. And I love this part. Was greatly heightened and inflamed by the circulation of caricatures in the form of pretended likenesses of defendant. And then I see, all of their handwriting, and I could see who these people are on all these supporting affidavits. And then this was interesting too, and I had no idea that this happened until I read it in this brief. While in jail, Polly was subject to rumors of, quote, illicit connection with some person or persons, and is now in a state of pregnancy. That was the rumor going around in Staten Island. They didn't talk about that in the press, and people would apparently come to her jail cell and just berate her, on Richmond County. And I wouldn't have gotten the story, these little vignettes, if the archivist hadn't spent all that time cataloging all that stuff, not knowing what it would be used for. So thank you, whoever did it decades ago, and preserving it now. Next. This was the other thing that saved me, because what happened was there were 3 trials, and by the time it gets to Newburgh, it's transferred to Newburgh to try to get a fair jury. The New York press is very fickle, and the public is tired. They just want Polly gone, and so they stopped covering it. So I thought, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to cover the 3rd trial. But fortunately, there are 2 copies of the 3, believe it or not, they had 3 newspapers in Newburgh in the 1840s. The only places that have them in the world, Newburgh Free Library and the originals in New York State Archives. And so and fortunately, they did have articles on the 3rd trial. And so I was able to complete the book. Again, had the newspapers not been preserved, and also I got to see the originals. I love seeing the originals, because then you see how they read it, and they're big and yellow, and you could see the ads right next to it. It's more it's a better experience actually even than scanning, although I appreciate the scanning as well. So next. So I did want to talk briefly, because the subtitle of the book is The Cursed Birth of Tabloid Justice. And what my argument is, this, along with a couple other cases around that time period, like Helen Jewett or Mary Rogers, really is the birth of tabloid media and tabloid justice. And what I mean by that is where, sort of sensationalized reporting affects and influences the public, and unfortunately, criminal cases, the course of criminal cases. And these are some examples. Of course, we all know about the Central Park Five. And I was a little kid, but I remember that when that was happening, and those images were frightening to many, many people. And this Wilding thing, we don't know exactly where that came from. They were later exonerated for the rape and beating of the poor jogger. These are more recent cases. Casey Anthony, the infamous Casey Anthony. This is during during her trials. False confessions didn't happen. There was a false confession with Polly too. They claimed that she had confessed. She had not. The Sun and the Herald ran it anyway. Well, the Sun ran, and then the Herald criticized them for running it, and then they fought about that. And then, of course, Foxy Noxy, of course, the Ice Maiden. And you can see, like, there's, like, stereotypes right in the coverage, like the Ice Maiden. So, like, she's cold and cruel. So we still, and this happens. This happens today. There, I can name a bunch of other cases. Next. So I do want to talk briefly about Edgar Allan Poe and true crime documentaries. Now, I am a true crime fan.
I skipped a slide, Alex.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, here we go. So now the first question is, will social media become our new living jury of the nation? During the Boston bombing case, there are all these sleuths that went online and were pointing the fingers and identifying people and coming up with their names and doxing them, and it made their lives hell for a few weeks. They were wrong. It was not, they did not identify correctly. They identified a whole bunch of other people. And then, of course, everyone knows, the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case, and people were, look, I understand why people dislike Amber Heard, like, some people can, but like the viciousness and also the, the instantaneous nature of it, like social media, it almost makes the tabloids look kind of quaint, actually, because that's all on anybody's smartphone. And I don't know how judges are going to deal with cases, with high profile cases going forward. Next. Now, Edgar Allan Poe, now remember, he kind of founds the detective story, Auguste Dupin, and he's always talking about how the police don't know what they're doing, right? And he's going to solve the crime, the great Edgar Allan Poe. And he's sort of like advocating, like, you, or at least if you're as brilliant as Edgar Allan Poe, you could solve your crime if you just read the newspapers, kind of. That's sort of his model. And it even says that the police don't know what they're, they try, but they're not doing very well. And so, if you look on Netflix, my God, have you seen like the lineup for true crime? It's like hundreds and hundreds of them. I mean, go online tonight and take a look. And look, I probably watched a third of them. I fully admit to it. Because it is compelling. But there are a couple of trends that bother me, and one of the reasons I actually wrote the book. This idea that you're going to, quote, solve a crime by sitting on your couch and watching a documentary on Netflix, or, it's set up like that. I was talking to Josie about this before the show. It's set up like where, well, they're just presenting and you decide, and like, but, and you sit there and, oh, I've got the crime solved. Now, the problem with that is, they're ultimately have to tell a story. And I experienced this even writing my book. I could very easily tilt it one way or the other, withhold information, because if you just throw all like the key evidence right out at the beginning and say, oh, they were clearly guilty, that's not much of a story, and so they, it gets very meta sometimes. There's been a number of these cases where they withhold evidence. Frankly, it's not good journalism. There is a case for good journalism to exonerate the innocent. I mean, the clearest example is the Thin Blue Line with Errol Morris, in which he actually did exonerate Randall Dale Adams. That's very rare. And what the problem is, everybody's chasing that now. Making a Murderer, I thought was, in my opinion, was an egregious example of this. It did come in for criticism, and they actually did a season 2 to kind of, in part, respond to that. But you know, I'm talking about the older suspect here, Stephen Avery. They left out the fact that there was, sweat DNA on, in the victim's car. That's pretty damning evidence, and they left that out because they wanted to build, I don't know exactly why they did it, but the problem is, and I'm both a lawyer and a writer, the problem is that you can't really duplicate a adversarial trial setting, because when I'm writing a book or I'm producing a documentary, there's not like a defense lawyer there or a prosecutor there to say, no, that's not quite right, or no, you're exaggerating, or hey, what about this? And so while they pretend to or claim to be balanced, I find it very, very difficult to do, and also just the need for to tell the story in a compelling way. So two of the most popular genres, not all of them, but two of the most popular genres are, we're going to solve a crime that's never been solved, okay? Or number two, and they invite you in, you're going to help solve it. You're watching, you're going to help decide. Or number two, I'm going to exonerate an innocent person. And like I said, there is a case for it. There have been, there's not many. There have been a handful of documentaries that did lead to at least the person going free, and in some cases exonerated. But many, many more have failed to do that. And in the process of doing that, some of them point the fingers to a whole bunch of other alternative suspects who, God knows, they may have nothing to do at all with it, but they point to, not to mention the living families. One thing I was able to rationalize this was that, everybody involved has been dead for over a century. But, they're doing what people are still alive. There's victims' families. It makes it a little queasy, to be honest with you. And also gives us a very skewed system, idea of the justice system. There are real problems with the justice system, but a well-represented defendant who got taken by a conspiracy, like, I'm sorry, that ain't at the top of the list. Okay. Like, that doesn't happen, really, but is like a common kind of theme or idea. Okay. So next, just wrapping up, I did want to do a special thank you, and I really meant this. The Archivists, New York State Archives, you guys are a top-notch organization. I've worked with many, many archives. Some organizations have, a lot of records, but the help is kind of, not always there, not always friendly. Some of them treat it like it's Fort Knox, and so they're almost nearly inaccessible. Other of them go the other way, unfortunately, like don't always have the resources. I see things, archives are kind of looted. And so it's like, oh, that's disappointing. New York Archives it hits the sweet spot. It just, like, to me, was just a beautiful experience because you give us access. You're very friendly. It's not hard. But at the same time, it's reliable. The things are in order. Things are in good condition. And most importantly of all, very helpful. Like, I actually, I was not expecting somebody to find an 1840s brief, and it took them a little while. They found it, though. They found it. And like I said, I wouldn't have gotten those terrific vignettes, and I wouldn't be able to finish the book also if somebody hadn't kept the newspapers and scanned them and kept the originals for me to look at. So thank you again, especially to James Foltz, and then Marissa Gitto, and there were others, but those were the ones that I remember and dealt with. So that's my presentation. Just a quick little plug if you're interested. I left some things out. I couldn't get into the whole story because there's 3 trials, and so it's hard to tell that all in an hour. But I tried to keep it, moving along quickly in the book as well. I hope you get it. It's a great gift for New York history lovers going into the holiday season. So that's my little plug. So thank you, Tom, and I welcome the discussion. Yep.
Thank you, Alex. It is a great book, and independent booksellers all over the state, all over the country would be able to find this wonderful resource for you. And I'm not going to ask you how any of these resulted, because you've got to buy the book to find out. But I do have just a couple of quick questions for you. And one relates to the connection between the tabloids and the court records. And just At the State Archives, we have probably 7,000 boxes, so 7,000 cubic feet of historical court records from 1690 to 1847, including this particular case. You're a trained attorney, but for the average researcher, is it difficult? What's the barrier to using court records in terms of your knowledge of what you're looking for and all that? Do you have any quick advice for a typical researcher using court records to find the truth about something they might have read about in an 1847 newspaper?
Yes, I would. First of all, you need to remember that the briefs, we have adversarial systems. So these briefs are argumentative and they are one-sided necessarily. Now, both sides, you get both sides, and so you have to keep that in mind. I would first just try to get a hold of everything you can get a hold of, because it will be helpful in some way. If nothing else, you could see how they wrote back then, and you can get an idea. You can, gives you vivid kind of experience and details. I would consult with a lawyer, to be honest with you. I even, I had to ask around about certain things, particularly criminal defense. I'm not really a criminal defense lawyer, and but why they did certain things a certain way. I found out some like kind of funny facts along the way. So, for example, they didn't feed jurors back then because they wanted them to stay together and to like come to a verdict. But my advice is get a hold of it, and if you're lucky, it'll be a New York State case. Get the appellate briefs. And then prepare to learn how to read 1800s handwriting, because that's painful. That's just hard. There's a skill to it. I have some friends who are actually kind of good at it, yeah.
Good. And I'll just remind anyone who's looking at this and thinking about using court records, we publish a wonderful book called Duly and Constantly Kept, which is a great, and written by Jim Foltz, and which is a great overview of all of the court records that we hold and preserve and make available for research at the State Archives here in New York. And
I will add one thing too. There also was a written court decision, and what's really nice about that's where like the judges are writing it. So presumably, they're going to be more neutral, and they're going to give you a lot of facts. And so that was very helpful too. So like, look for the court opinion. If there's a big court case in New York, you're in luck. Is a very good chance the New York State Archives has it. Other states, you might not be so lucky, but yeah.
We are very fortunate that the New York courts, particularly the historical court records, were preserved intact, and they are here at the archives. The last thing I'll just comment on, and this is more a comment than a question. New York benefited from something called the New York State Newspaper Project, which microfilmed and now has started to digitize and preserve as many of the historical newspapers in New York as possible. And so if you go to the New York State Library, which preserves all of that and makes it available, if you're trying to do your research in some case, and trying to connect the historical court records, the truth, with the sensational journalism that might be present in the newspaper, and starting your own research, you've got resources at your disposal. I'll stop my marketing and turn it over to Josie to ask a couple of questions.
Thank you. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is repeat the name of the book by request. It's Duly and Constantly Kept. That's the name of the book that that describes the court records in the New York State Archives. It's a great resource. We also had one comment that I'll share about P.T. Barnum. People apparently have strong opinions, but one of our guests says he is underrated as one of the worst humans in history. So
I would agree with that, actually. I mean, I held back a little bit here, but he would do anything for a book, including putting a woman on capital murder's life in jeopardy. Let's just keep that in mind. So I completely agree.
And Barnum shows up in a number of the court cases that are in the state archives, where somebody was mad at him or he was mad at someone else.
Yeah, we actually have an example of that coming up in our next issue, our winter issue. So we're working on that now. So if you're interested in more about P.T. Barnum as a terrible person, go ahead and subscribe to the magazine. So we do have one question though about whether Polly ever had an opportunity to testify or give her side of the story in any way.
So they made a decision that she would not testify, and for good reason. It's common advice not to testify, and she would have had to explain a lot. She did speak out a few times, though. She always proclaimed her innocence. Her family proclaimed her innocence. She said that she had no friends and essentially was scapegoated, is what sort of her take was. They instantly thought she was guilty. And her brother accused George Waite of being the murderer. And then curiously, she was very offended by P.T. Barnum's wax figure, and she wanted to sue Barnum for some kind of defamation. And her lawyer made the better decision not to do that in the middle of a criminal trial. But at the end of the trial, she's reported to have said, can we sue Barnum now? So she really hated P.T. Barnum too. And she did then later, it was a very strange coda. Somebody had written kind of follow-up years later in the New York Herald saying she was peddling fruit in Philadelphia, but she took great offense to this because she was kind of haughty, and she was come from an old line wealthy Dutch family. He said, I have all the comforts in the world and I would never have, peddled fruit. And so it was like a weird, kind of last word on it. But then she was silent for the rest of her life. Her defense team tried to fill in the details. They said basically George Waite did it. There's reasonable doubt. Her sister, Emma, saw her alive and, argued for her innocence. Yeah.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much. I think that's kind of the end of our questions, but there's so much more to learn about the trial. So if you are interested in the subject, you should definitely get your hands on a copy of the book. And thank you so much, Alex and Tom, for this insightful presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more about the New York State Archives, please visit the website at archives.nysed.gov. And if you're interested in what we do at the Archives Partnership Trust to support the work of the archives, please visit our website at nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to help keep New York State's history alive. You can always, if you're interested in the content we create or you have some ideas about content we could be looking into for future programming, please send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. And lastly, for our own little plug, please join us on November 12th at 12:30 p.m. for our next online speaker series. This one's called Armories Around New York, and it's with retired Colonel Richard Comstock and author Nancy Todd. You can find out more about that program and register for it at nysarchivestrust.org. Alex and Tom, thank you so much again, and I hope you have a great day.